Before we move on to Africa in the next couple of weeks, we're going to go ahead and finish off Asia by talking about the final fall of the Byzantine Empire, or really the end of Rome, the establishment of the Ottoman Empire, and the creation of Russia. The Byzantine Empire had taken a heavy blow during the 7th century Islamic conquests. In fact, by the end of the 11th century, they had to ask the Roman Catholic Christians of Central and Western Europe for help in defending themselves. Remember, the Byzantines were what we call Eastern Orthodox. They followed the Patriarch in Constantinople, while the rest of the Germanic kingdoms followed the Pope in Rome. This call for help from the Roman Catholics sparked the Crusades. But the Crusaders weren't really interested in giving back any of the land they conquered to the Byzantines. They kept the Levant for themselves. In fact, on the Fourth Crusade at the beginning of the 13th century, Catholic Christians, instead of attacking Muslims, sacked and took Constantinople. For a little while, they ruled the Byzantine Empire as Catholic rulers. Byzantine emperors were able to reassert themselves in 1261, though, but they ruled over a much smaller area. Constantinople was still a powerful trading city, but they had to depend on allies in order to survive. Mostly, they allied with Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe and Russia, to the north of the Black Sea here. It was the Byzantines who had converted many of these folks to Orthodox Christianity. And when the Mongols invaded, they actually allied with them against the Turks. The Sultanate of Rum was the greatest threat to Byzantine survival at this time. Unfortunately for the Byzantines, the Slavs at this point were not a very powerful people, and after the fall of the Mongols in the 14th century, the Byzantines were essentially on their own. And while the Sultanate of Rum was starting to fall apart, one of its noblemen had founded his own dynasty, the Ottomans, and that Ottoman dynasty was slowly eating away at Byzantine land. In 1453, in a terrifying epic siege, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks, who then changed the name of the city to Istanbul. Throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, the Ottomans had a series of excellent sultans. They were able to conquer the Balkans, this peninsula of Europe. In 1517, they had done what the Mongols hadn't done, and conquered the Mamluks of Egypt. Now you should remember that the Mamluks had been keeping that minor Abbasid family as their caliph, or as their court prize that they could pull out whenever anybody was visiting. So officially, the Abbasid Caliphate was still continuing. So when the Ottomans conquered Egypt, they forced the last Abbasid caliph to pass his title on to them, officially making them the Ottoman Caliphate, though they still usually use the Turkish term sultan. Their empire peaked underneath their greatest sultan, Suleiman, who ruled from 1520 to 1566. Underneath him, they really saw themselves as the Third Rome, Rome being the original, the Byzantine Empire being Rome Part 2, and now there was the Islamic Rome, Part 3. Just to the north, though, the Slavs of Russia had made the same claim. With the fall of Constantinople, they were really the new center of Orthodox Christianity. If anybody was the Third Rome, it had to be the seat of the Roman Christian religion, which really was the Eastern Orthodox religion. In 1547, Ivan IV, or Ivan the Terrible, named himself the Tsar of the Russians. Tsar is just a Russian word for Caesar, which was just a title for Roman emperors. Tsars in Moscow and St. Petersburg would rule Russia for the next 370 years. Back down to the south of Russia, by the 17th century, the Ottomans were having some problems. Like the Abbasids, they had relied on slave soldiers, they called them janissaries. They obtained these slaves as children from Slavic Christians living in the Balkan region. You might remember this goes against Muhammad's command to not do things like enslave people of the book. Not everybody always follows what the religion says. As far as they were concerned, they were taking infidels, they were taking Christian boys. Though after enslaving them, they did convert them to Islam and raise them as Muslims. They were allowed to be slaves because they were enslaved before they were converted. And like with the Abbasids, these slave soldiers were given tons of privileges. They eventually became so entitled they started playing a part in several coups, overthrowing one sultan in favor of another. By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire, which really was part of European politics, was being referred to by European diplomats as, quote, the sick man of Europe. At the beginning of that century, they finally got rid of the Janissaries, but they weren't able to keep up with the technological developments that were happening in the rest of Europe. And in World War I, the Ottoman Empire sided with the Germans and the Austrians. If you haven't heard, they lost. When they lost, Britain and France carved up their empire in West Asia. They allowed the Turks to keep Anatolia, and in 1922 the Turks reorganized their state as the Republic of Turkey, which exists until this day. World War I also spelled the end of the other Third Rome, Tsarist Russia. In 1917, soldiers and factory workers overthrew the Tsar, and in 1922 they founded what they called the Soviet Union. And it should be noted that the Soviet Union, which had a brutal government, did make Russia a world power, a superpower. By 1991, though, it had lost the Cold War and had fallen apart. That same year, the Russian Federation was created, which still exists until this day. And that's the history of Asia. Over the next couple of weeks, we're going to go ahead and back up to the beginning, go over the history of the African continent, and then we'll wrap up with what Europe did in the modern period.